What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Happy, Go Lucky, back at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth, as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. Lurking in the shadows are a group of elite men who control foreign policy and relations. Keep in mind, a policy is a set of guidelines or principles adopted by an organization to achieve a specific goal, while a law is a legally binding rule established by a government authority that must be followed by everyone, with potential penalties for non-compliance. Essentially, a policy outlines desired actions and intentions, whereas a law sets clear enforceable standards and restrictions. Laws are enforceable by legal means, like courts, while policies are typically enforced internally within an organization, and may not have legal repercussions for violation. Policies can be more flexible and adaptable to specific situations within an organization, whereas laws apply broadly to everyone within their jurisdiction. Laws are created by legislative bodies, while policies are developed by organizations or individuals within their authority. A company might have a policy stating that employees should dress professionally, but there is no legal penalty for not adhering to this guideline. A traffic law that sets a speed limit and includes fines for exceeding it is a legal requirement that must be followed by everyone. In law, foreign means the law of another country or jurisdiction. It can also refer to a person who is not a national of the country where they live. This elite group are known as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, is an American think tank specializing in U.S. foreign policy and international relations. Founded in 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations is an independent, nonpartisan 501(c)(3) nonprofit membership organization, think tank, and publisher dedicated to being a resource for its members, government officials, business executives, journalists, educators and students, civic and religious leaders, and other interested citizens in order to help them better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. The Council on Foreign Relations is an American think tank specializing in U.S. foreign policy and international relations. CFR is based in New York City, with an additional office in Washington, D.C. Its membership has included senior politicians, secretaries of state, CIA directors, bankers, lawyers, professors, corporate directors, CEOs, and prominent media figures. Not to be confused with United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations or European Council on Foreign Relations. The Council sponsors several hundred meetings each year, provides up-to-date information and analysis on its website, cfr.org, and publishes Foreign Affairs, the preeminent journal in the field, as well as dozens of other reports and videos by noted experts. The Council on Foreign Relations is possibly the U.S. organization outside the U.S. government that has had the greatest influence on Washington's foreign policy. Created in 1921 when the United States was emerging as the world's leading power at the end of the Great War in Europe, since then the CFR has been the great think tank that has thought and rethought the role and actions of the United States on the international scene. On its 100th anniversary in 2021, the CFR published this brief history, written by George Gavrilis as a notary, which reviews its development throughout this time. What is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization? Organizations organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, educational, or other specified purposes, and that meet certain other requirements are tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Code, Section 501(c)(3). 501(c)(3) organizations are commonly referred to as charitable organizations. Their primary purpose is to serve the public interest by engaging in activities such as religious, educational, scientific, or charitable work. The multiplicity of think tanks in the United States, some as notorious as Brookings Institution, CSIS, AEI or Wilson Center Hoover Institution on the West Coast, may blur the preeminence that the CFR had for several decades. Born as a bipartisan organization and with the broad field of international office as its object of study, the other centers named emerged later with a more precise thematic and ideological spectrum. Throughout these 100 years, many of the Council's prominent members have been Secretaries of State, White House advisors, or personal advisors to the President. It would be quicker to address the exception. Which of the most outstanding figures in American foreign policy were not part of the CFR? Thus, the Council's board or the leadership of one of its study groups has included George Kennan, Hans Morgenthau, William Bundy, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, or Cyrus Vance. David Rockefeller was chair of the organization, and several U.S. presidents were members before reaching the White House, such as Richard Nixon or George H.W. Bush. A think tank is an organization that conducts research on various policy issues with the primary goal of generating ideas and analysis to influence public policy by providing information and recommendations to policymakers, often through reports, studies, and public forums, essentially acting as a hub for intellectual discussion and policy development on diverse topics like economics, social issues, and technology. Key points about think tanks. Focus on research and analysis. They primarily produce research papers, reports, and analyses on various topics to inform policy decisions. Policy influence. The main objective is to impact public policy by providing insights and recommendations to government officials and other stakeholders. Diverse expertise. Think tanks often gather experts from different disciplines to provide a comprehensive perspective on complex issues. Public engagement. Many think tanks also engage with the public through publications, conferences, and media appearances to raise awareness about important issues. Funding sources. Think tanks can be funded by private donations, government grants, corporate sponsorships, or a combination of sources. Examples of think tank topics: economic policy, healthcare policy, environmental policy, national security, education policy, and technology policy. Likewise, the magazine Foreign Affairs, published by the CFR since September 1922, has had competitors multiplied in the era of the internet and online media, but the magazine continues to have undoubted prestige. Many of its articles have had an enormous echo, such as the shortened version of the long telegram of Mr. X, Kennan, or others whose thesis authors later developed them into high-impact videos, such as The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. The editors or directors of the magazine have had great relevance, such as Fareed Zakaria and Gideon Rose. When a self-confident United States, after expanding from coast to coast and establishing its influence in the inter-American order, began to look to other continents, it felt the need for experts on any part of the world who could accompany the decision-making of American political power, as Gavrilis explains. With President Woodrow Wilson, they traveled to Europe for the Paris Peace Lecture that put an end to World War I and established the League of Nations. Several academics, who then wanted to be able to prolong the intellectual work that they had begun to develop in group. The purpose was to give strategic weight to the decisions that could be taken by the American political elite in that new era of great world power, while influencing an American society accustomed to isolationism and which viewed the new internationalism with suspicion. The CFR was constituted as an association of members who contributed economic quotas for the support of the activities, which were behind closed doors. Only on rare occasions did they organize public events. Over time, the organization grew, expanded its headquarters. The main office is in New York, but it also has a large building in Washington. And although it has largely maintained its desire to debate out of the spotlight, today it has a large staff and a millionaire budget. The video reviews the tone of the different periods: moments of leadership, more atonic periods, times with fewer resources due to economic crises. In general, the CFR has known how to orient its work of agreement with each circumstance. It is normal that being a video paid for by the institution itself, as a celebration of its long life, it is not particularly critical of any episode of the past that could tarnish its fame. It must also be accepted that no shadows are mentioned of Haas's presidency, in which he has been for 20 years. In any case, test that the CFR has not done too badly for U.S. interests is that, in a particularly competitive think tank environment, it continues to obtain substantial private sector funding for its work. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, provides independent, evidence-based analysis and recommendations to help policymakers, business leaders, journalists, and the general public meet the health challenges of a globalized world. Their goal is to promote awareness about the need to better understand foreign policy decisions and the world around them. Through rigorous research, practical policy proposals, and extensive discussions with policymakers, experts, and opinion leaders, the CFR Global Health Program facilitates timely debate and better understanding of pressing global topics. CFR's global experts work to inform the general public about these issues by regularly publishing op-eds and articles, background analysis, teaching notes, multimedia, videos, and reports. This site is an excellent source of resources for developing instructional materials for students in college and graduate school. The organization provides a free simulation program which allows students to practice decision-making skills, honed through 17 case studies. CFR meetings convene government officials, global business leaders, and prominent members of the intelligence and foreign policy communities to discuss international issues. CFR publishes the bi-monthly journal Foreign Affairs since 1922. It also runs the David Rockefeller Studies Program, which makes recommendations to presidential administrations and the diplomatic community, testifies before Congress, interacts with the media, and publishes research on foreign policy issues. Michael Froman is the organization's 15th president. In September 1917, near the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson established a working fellowship of about 150 scholars called the Inquiry, tasked with briefing him about options for the post-war world after Germany was defeated. This academic group, directed by Wilson's closest advisor and longtime friend, Colonel Edward M. House, and with Walter Lippmann as head of research, met to assemble the strategy for the post-war world. The team produced more than 2,000 documents detailing and analyzing the political, economic, and social facts globally that would be helpful for Wilson in the peace talks. Their reports formed the basis for the 14 points, which outlined Wilson's strategy for peace after the war's end. These scholars then traveled to the Paris Peace Conference 1919 and participated in the discussions there. As a result of discussions at the Peace Conference, a small group of British and American diplomats and scholars met on May 30, 1919, at the Hotel Majestic in Paris. They decided to create an Anglo-American organization called the Institute of International Affairs, which would have offices in London and New York. Ultimately, the British and American delegates formed separate institutes, with the British developing the Royal Institute of International Affairs, known as Chatham House, in London. Due to the isolationist views prevalent in American society at that time, the scholars had difficulty gaining traction with their plan and turned their focus instead to a set of discrete meetings which had been taking place since June 1918 in New York City, under the name Council on Foreign Relations. The meetings were headed by corporate lawyer Elihu Root, who had served as Secretary of State under President Theodore Roosevelt, and attended by 108 high-ranking officers of banking, manufacturing, trading, and finance companies, together with many lawyers. A critical study found that of 502 government officials surveyed from 1945 to 1972, more than half were members of the council. During the Eisenhower administration, 40% of the top U.S. foreign policy officials were CFR members. Eisenhower himself had been a council member. Under Truman, 42% of the top posts were filled by council members. During the Kennedy administration, this number rose to 51% and peaked at 57% under the Johnson administration. In an anonymous piece called The Sources of Soviet Conduct that appeared in Foreign Affairs in 1947, CFR study group member George Kennan coined the term containment. The essay would prove to be highly influential in U.S. foreign policy for 7 upcoming presidential administrations. 40 years later, Kennan explained that he had never suspected the Russians of any desire to launch an attack on America. He thought that it was obvious enough and he did not need to explain it in his essay. William Bundy credited CFR's study groups with helping to lay the framework of thinking that led to the Marshall Plan and NATO. Due to new interest in the group, membership grew towards 1,000. Dwight D. Eisenhower chaired a CFR study group while he served as president of Columbia University. One member later said, "Whatever General Eisenhower knows about economics, he has learned at the study group meetings." The CFR study group devised an expanded study group called Americans for Eisenhower, to increase his chances for the presidency. Eisenhower would later draw many cabinet members from CFR ranks and become a CFR member himself. His primary CFR appointment was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Dulles gave a public address at the Harold Pratt House in New York City, in which he announced a new direction for Eisenhower's foreign policy. There is no local defense which alone will contain the mighty land power of the communist world. Local defenses must be reinforced by the further deterrent of massive retaliatory power. After this speech, the Council convened a session on nuclear weapons and foreign policy, and chose Henry Kissinger to head it. Kissinger spent the following academic year working on the project at Council headquarters. The video of the same name that he published from his research in 1957 gave him national recognition, topping the national bestseller lists. CFR played an important role in the creation of the European coal and steel community. CFR promoted a blueprint of the ECSC and helped Jean Monnet promote the ESCS. On November 24, 1953, a study group heard a report from political scientist William Henderson regarding the ongoing conflict between France and Vietnamese Communist leader Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces, a struggle that would later become known as the First Indochina War. Henderson argued that Ho's cause was primarily nationalist in nature, and that Marxism had little to do with the current revolution. Further, the report said, the United States could work with Ho to guide his movement away from communism. State Department officials, however, expressed skepticism about direct American intervention in Vietnam, and the idea was tabled. Over the next 20 years, the United States would find itself allied with anti-communist South Vietnam and against Ho and his supporters in the Vietnam War. The Council served as a breeding ground for important American policies such as mutual deterrence, arms control, and nuclear non-proliferation. In 1962, the group began a program of bringing select Air Force officers to the Harold Pratt House to study alongside its scholars. The Army, Navy, and Marine Corps requested they start similar programs for their own officers. A 4-year-long study of relations between America and China was conducted by the Council between 1964 and 1968. One study published in 1966 concluded that American citizens were more open to talks with China than their elected leaders. Henry Kissinger had continued to publish in foreign affairs and was appointed by President Richard Nixon to serve as National Security Advisor in 1969. In 1971, he embarked on a secret trip to Beijing to broach talks with Chinese leaders. Nixon went to China in 1972, and diplomatic relations were completely normalized by President Carter's Secretary of State, another Council member, Cyrus Vance. The Vietnam War created a rift within the organization. When Hamilton Fish Armstrong announced in 1970 that he would be leaving the helm of foreign affairs after 45 years, new chairman David Rockefeller approached a family friend, William Bundy, to take over the position. Anti-war advocates within the Council rose in protest against this appointment, claiming that Bundy's hawkish record in the State and Defense Departments and the CIA precluded him from taking over an independent journal. Some considered Bundy a war criminal for his prior actions. In November 1979, while chairman of CFR, David Rockefeller became embroiled in an international incident when he and Henry Kissinger, along with John J. McCloy and Rockefeller aides, persuaded President Jimmy Carter through the State Department to admit the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, into the U.S. for hospital treatment for lymphoma. This action directly precipitated what is known as the Iran hostage crisis and placed Rockefeller under intense media scrutiny, particularly from the New York Times, for the first time in his public life. In his video White House Diary, Carter wrote of the affair, April 9, 1979. David Rockefeller came in, apparently to induce me to let the Shah come to the United States. Rockefeller, Kissinger, and Brzezinski seem to be adopting this as a joint project. The CFR has two types of membership, life membership and term membership, which lasts for 5 years and is available only to those between the ages of 30 and 36. Only U.S. citizens, native-born or naturalized, and permanent residents who have applied for U.S. citizenship are eligible. A candidate for life membership must be nominated in writing by one council member and seconded by a minimum of 3 others. Visiting fellows are prohibited from applying for membership until they have completed their fellowship tenure. Corporate membership is divided into associates, affiliates, president's circle, and founders. All corporate executive members have opportunities to hear speakers, including foreign heads of state, chairmen, and CEOs of multinational corporations, and U.S. officials and congressmen. President and premium members are also entitled to attend small, private dinners or receptions with senior American officials and world leaders. The CFR has a young professionals briefing series designed for young leaders interested in international relations to be eligible for term membership. Women were excluded from membership until the 1960s.